In March of 1943, a letter arrived at roughly 1,500 front doors in southeastern Washington state. It gave every family 30 days to leave. No hearing, no explanation, no name for what was coming. Just a date, a signature, and an order to be gone. The towns in that letter were called Hanford and White Bluffs. Real places. Real farms. Orchards planted by hand, decades earlier, along a bend in the Columbia River. Within a year, both towns were gone, burned, bulldozed, wiped off the maps Americans used to navigate their own country. For the next 4 decades, the United States government made sure almost no one asked why. Stolen orchards, disturbed graves, a secret weapon that ended a world war, a poison still leaking into a river today. This is not a slow abandonment ghost town story. This is a story about deliberate, funded, classified erasure. It starts with people who had no idea they were standing on the most important 30,000 acres in America. If you're the kind of person who wants the real paper trail behind America's forgotten places, not the campfire version, the version with the documents attached, you're in the right spot. Subscribe now, because what happened to these 2 towns only gets stranger from here. To understand what was taken, you first have to understand what was actually there. The high desert of south-central Washington does not look like farm country to most outsiders. Sagebrush and sand, cut through by a wide, cold, gray-green river. Summers climb past 100 degrees. Winters bring a hard, dry cold off the plateau. To the first American settlers who passed through in the 1880s, it looked like nothing worth stopping for. Land promoters saw something else. Water rights. Cheap acreage. A growing nation that could not get enough fruit. In 1907, a company called the Hanford Irrigation and Power Company laid out a town site on the east bank of the Columbia, naming it after one of its own investors. A few miles upriver, a second community grew up around a pale, chalky cliff face visible for miles across the flat desert. A landmark so distinctive that early travelers simply called the place White Bluffs, and the name stuck. Both towns depended entirely on irrigation. Engineers cut canals from the river, and within a decade the sagebrush along the water's edge had been replaced, row by row, with apple trees, pear trees, cherry orchards, melon patches, and vineyards. Trees planted in 1910 didn't reach full production until the 1920s. An entire generation of farmers effectively bet their working lives on land that hadn't proven anything yet. It paid off. By the 1920s and 1930s, Hanford and White Bluffs were no longer frontier outposts. Banks, hotels, general stores, churches, a ferry crossing, a rail spur for shipping fruit east, a high school that fielded its own football team, in the kind of small community where everyone knew whose orchard belonged to whom. The 1940 census recorded 463 residents in Hanford alone. Add White Bluffs, the outlying farms, and the ranches scattered along the river, and the population of the area the government would soon seize stood at close to 2,000 people, spread across roughly 500 square miles of farmland, homesteads, and open range. Among them was a German immigrant orchard farmer named Paul Ludwig Bruggemann, who had built a fruit operation near White Bluffs with his family over more than 2 decades, clearing sagebrush by hand, laying out rows, waiting years for young trees to bear their first real harvest. His children would grow up to become 2 of the most important eyewitnesses to what happened next. Not because they were prominent people, because, unlike almost everyone else who lived through it, they kept the paperwork. Before the irrigation companies arrived, the land had supported only scattered ranching and the long-standing seasonal presence of the region's native nations. The transformation into fruit country was a remarkable feat of engineering and stubbornness. Canals blasted through hard-pan desert soil, pumping stations built to lift river water uphill to orchard rows that would otherwise have stayed permanently dry. It is easy looking back to read the eventual government seizure as inevitable. It did not feel that way to the people who had just spent 30 years making the desert productive by hand. Life ran on the rhythm of the harvest. Hand-dug ditches in the cool early mornings, picking through the brutal heat of late summer. Crates shipped out by rail and riverboat before the first frost. Church socials, football games, county fairs. The ordinary texture of small-town life, largely undocumented because nothing about it seemed like it needed documenting. Nobody in Hanford or White Bluffs believed they were living somewhere historically significant. That, it would turn out, was exactly the point. White Bluffs had its own small skyline by the 1930s, if you could call it that. A poured concrete bank building. Unusual for a town its size. A 2-story hotel. Storefronts along the main street facing the river. A ferry ran passengers and freight across the Columbia on a fixed schedule, one of the only crossings for miles in either direction. Families who had lived there since the 1910s had buried parents and infant children in a small cemetery on a rise above the town. Ground every American farm town sets aside almost as an afterthought, never imagining it will one day matter to a federal agency 3,000 miles away. Hanford, a little further downriver, had grown up around its own rail depot and irrigation headworks, with a schoolhouse that doubled as the social center of the community. Dances, elections, church services, Friday night football games that drew farm families in from homesteads 10 and 15 miles out. Newspapers from the era describe bumper fruit harvests, prize-winning melons at the county fair, road grading, water rights disputes, school board elections. Nothing in the surviving record suggests anyone believed they were sitting on anything but good, ordinary farmland. 3,000 miles away, in the final weeks of 1942, a small group of Army officers and physicists were combing military survey maps for a stretch of American land that satisfied an extraordinarily narrow set of requirements. Remote enough to isolate from major population centers, access to enormous amounts of electricity, and above all, a massive, cold, dependable source of water in quantities most American rivers simply couldn't provide. The Columbia River, flowing quietly past 2 small fruit-growing towns almost no one outside the region had ever heard of, matched every requirement almost perfectly. Nobody explained this to the towns. Nobody explained it to anyone. On March 9, 1943, the notices went out. A federal letter citing Wartime Emergency Authority informed residents that their land was being acquired for what it vaguely described as important war work. Depending on the family, the notice gave anywhere from 28 to 90 days to vacate, though the number that stuck hardest in local memory, repeated for the next 70 years, was 30. One displaced resident, recalling the moment the letter was opened at the family's own kitchen table, later described a wave of disbelief that only made sense because the country was at war, because the family had always considered itself the kind that answered when the government called, even without knowing what it was being called to do. They did not know what they were giving up or why. They only knew the government wanted their homes, their orchards, and their town, gone before spring planting was even finished. Word spread from farm to farm faster than the government could have anticipated. Neighbors compared letters at the general store, at church, over back fences, trying to piece together a pattern that refused to form. Some notices gave a family 3 days, others gave 3 months. No visible logic to the difference. No map anyone could see. A handful of local leaders tried to get answers. County officials, the congressman's office, newspapers in Spokane and Yakima. Same vague language every time. Wartime necessity. A project of national importance. Details that could not be disclosed. In a country still fighting a 2-front war with sons and husbands already overseas. Very few residents felt they had standing to push back harder than that. Not everyone left without protest. A small number of residents reportedly refused to sign the government's initial paperwork, forcing formal condemnation proceedings rather than voluntary sale, a legal distinction that changed very little about the outcome, but left a slightly longer paper trail for later researchers to follow. Local law enforcement, itself made up of neighbors and relatives of the families being displaced, found itself sworn to uphold federal orders it had no part in writing. Teachers had to explain why the school year was ending early, why the football season would not be finished. Report cards, yearbooks, graduation photographs from that final spring survive today as some of the most poignant records of the town's last months, ordinary teenage milestones, captured just weeks before the entire student body scattered. The notice itself has survived. Copies still exist in family collections and federal archives, and reading one now is, if anything, stranger than not knowing what it said at all. It cites Public Proclamation No. 18, issued by the Western Defense Command and Fourth Army, headquartered at the Presidio in San Francisco. It informs the recipient that their continued presence inside a newly designated total exclusion area now violates federal wartime law. A legal citation. A deadline. Nothing about what the exclusion area is for. Nothing about who will occupy the land once the family is gone. Nothing about whether they will ever be allowed to return. Families like the Brueggemans read the letter over and over, searching for a clue that simply wasn't there. Rumors filled the space the government had left empty. A new army training ground. An airfield. Another wartime munitions plant like the ones already scattered across the country by 1943. A few, reasonably enough, assumed a clerical mistake, and that if they simply waited, the order would quietly be withdrawn. It was not a mistake, and no one from the government was coming to explain it. These families were standing at the outer edge of what would become the single most secretive weapons program in American history, so deliberately compartmentalized that most of the scientists working on individual pieces of it did not know what the final product would be. If the physicists themselves were kept in the dark, the orchard farmers along the Columbia never stood a chance. Compensation was thin, by nearly every surviving family account. Government appraisers moved through the area on a compressed wartime schedule, assigning values with little room for negotiation and almost no realistic path to appeal. For land that had taken a full generation to clear, irrigate, and bring into production, many families felt the number on the check did not come close to covering what they were actually losing. Appraisals were often conducted in a single pass, sometimes without the landowner present, valuing decades of accumulated labor using standardized formulas built for speed rather than accuracy. A young orchard could be replaced with money. A 20-year-old orchard, heavy with trees just entering their most productive years, effectively could not, no matter what number appeared on the check. Families who tried to relocate elsewhere in the region frequently found the payout covered only a fraction of what it cost to buy comparable land and replant from nothing. Anger surfaced in the only ways still available to people who had already lost the argument. Wartime patriotism kept most residents from open defiance, but not from private fury. Multiple orchard owners, forced to abandon fruit trees they would never be allowed to harvest, spent their final days on the land cutting the trees down themselves, rather than leave a thriving orchard behind for whoever came next. Not vandalism. Not quite protest either. The last decision left was still entirely theirs to make. Even the people who would go to work inside the fences were bound by secrecy that reached into their own households. New hires signed non-disclosure agreements under the Espionage Act, forbidding them from discussing anything about their jobs, even in the vaguest terms, with spouses, parents, or children. Wives of workers in Richland later recalled learning what their husbands had actually built, only when it was announced on the radio after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, years after some of them had moved to the area, and years after the orchards down the road had already been bulldozed to make room for it. Then a detail that even researchers who have spent years with this material still find unsettling. Nobody knew. The government did not just take the living town, it took the dead as well. The White Bluffs Cemetery held the remains of 177 people, pioneers, founders, children who had never made it to adulthood, buried across 3 decades of the community's history. In May of 1943, all 177 sets of remains were disinterred and relocated nearly 30 miles away to a cemetery in the town of Prosser, so the original burial ground could be cleared along with everything else in the exclusion zone. Government contractors carried out the relocation on a tight schedule with little of the ceremony families would ordinarily expect. Headstones were pulled, numbered, and moved along with whatever remains could still be recovered after decades in the ground, then reset at Prosser in roughly the same relative arrangement, an attempt at continuity that satisfied almost no one who had actually watched it happen. For families already reeling from a 30-day eviction, watching their parents' or children's graves dug up and trucked away added a second, quieter loss on top of the first. Families were not simply losing a hometown. They were losing the last physical record that their ancestors had ever lived there at all. The legal mechanism was eminent domain, the government's constitutional power to take private property for public use, provided it pays just compensation. In ordinary peacetime circumstances, condemnation proceedings can stretch on for months or years, with landowners given real opportunity to contest an appraisal in court. Wartime authority collapsed that entire process into weeks. Several families did attempt to challenge their compensation afterward, filing claims in federal court in the years following the war. Some produced modest additional settlements. Most did not. Once the family's 30 days ran out, demolition and clearing crews moved through both towns methodically, and in a number of documented cases, homes and orchards were deliberately set on fire to clear the ground quickly rather than dismantled board by board. Entire blocks that had taken decades to settle, wire for electricity, and plants with fruit trees were leveled and burned inside a matter of months. By fall, Hanford and White Bluffs stood empty. Homes sat locked, curtains still hanging in the windows. Fields tended by hand for 30 years went untouched for the first time in a generation, and behind new security fences the army had thrown up almost overnight, something enormous had already begun rising out of the sagebrush where the orchards used to be. The people building it arrived faster than anyone in the region had ever seen a workforce move. And, as it turned out, they didn't know what they were building either. Within months of the evacuation notices going out, the empty farmland around Hanford and White Bluffs had become one of the largest construction sites in the history of the United States. The federal government partnered with the DuPont Chemical Company to manage the project, officially designated the Hanford Engineer Works. At its peak, the construction workforce swelled to roughly 50,000 people, more than 20 times the combined population of the two towns just cleared to make room for them. An entire temporary city sprang up almost overnight, barracks, mess halls, a hospital, even a movie theater, built in a matter of months on ground that had been orchard rows the previous spring, and in a detail that says as much about 1940s America as it does about the project itself. The housing was strictly segregated by race. White workers and their families were assigned to a newly built planned community called Richland, constructed specifically to support the project with modern amenities and family housing. Black workers, and other workers of color, were routed instead to segregated camps and housing in the nearby town of Pasco. Denied access to the same neighborhoods, schools, and services extended to their white co-workers doing the same essential wartime labor. Thousands of black workers, many recruited from the American South by labor agents promising good wartime wages, arrived to find that essential war work did not come with equal housing, equal pay, or equal treatment on site. Barracks in the segregated camps were often more crowded and less well maintained than those provided to white construction crews doing comparable jobs. It was, in miniature, the same pattern playing out across dozens of wartime industrial boomtowns nationwide. An urgent national project, built by a workforce the country still refused to treat equally, even while asking every part of it to keep the same secret. Security around the site was near total. Armed guards, manned checkpoints, a complete press blackout. Workers were told only what they needed to know to complete their individual task, and nothing more. Welders who spent years inside the facility's core buildings sometimes had no real understanding of what the machines they were assembling actually did once finished. Not a failure of communication, but deliberate policy, so that no single worker, if captured or careless, could hand an enemy the door. Full picture. Turnover was enormous. Tens of thousands of workers cycled through over the project's construction phase, most staying only months before moving on, which meant the overwhelming majority of the people who physically built Hanford's reactors left the area entirely before the first one ever went critical, never learning what their labor had ultimately produced. What those 50,000 disconnected workers were building, piece by compartmentalized piece, were the world's first full-scale nuclear reactors, engineered to produce a newly discovered, man-made element called plutonium. The underlying science had only been proven at a tiny experimental scale a few months earlier, in December of 1942, when physicist Enrico Fermi and his team achieved the first controlled nuclear chain reaction inside a converted squash court beneath a football stadium at the University of Chicago. That reactor, known as Chicago Pile 1, produced barely enough power to light a single bulb. Hanford's reactors were designed to scale that same untested, laboratory-sized process up by a factor of thousands, using the Columbia River itself as an industrial-scale cooling system. An engineering leap some of the project's own physicists privately worried might not be controllable at all once. Fully powered up, a handful had even raised and then set aside theoretical concerns about whether a full-scale chain reaction could somehow become impossible to stop once started. It didn't happen. But the fact that some of the smartest people in the country weren't entirely certain going in says something about how far beyond anything previously attempted this project actually was. Hanford was one leg of a three-part national effort history would eventually remember as the Manhattan Project. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a separate secret city enriched uranium. In Los Alamos, New Mexico, scientists designed the weapon itself. At Hanford, on ground that had belonged to the Bruggeman family and their neighbors for a generation, the government was manufacturing the explosive core. The three sites rarely communicated directly. Materials, personnel, and results moved between them through a small, tightly controlled chain of command in Washington, D.C. Three separate secret cities scattered across three different states, each one convinced it held only a fragment of a much larger picture, which in fact it did. Hanford's fragment happened to be built directly on top of somebody's front porch. The centerpiece was a structure that came to be known simply as the B reactor, a 100-foot-tall block of graphite and steel built directly on the former farmland, designed to do something no engineer on Earth had ever successfully done at this scale before. Construction crews poured concrete and stacked graphite blocks around the clock, racing a deadline set not by any customer or shareholder, but by fear that Nazi Germany's own scientists might reach the same breakthrough first. The speed still startled historians who study the project today. Ground was broken in the summer of 1943. By September of 1944, barely 14 months later, the B reactor achieved criticality, a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction, the first ever produced in a full-scale industrial facility anywhere on the planet. From orchard rose to functioning nuclear reactor in roughly the time it takes an apple tree to recover from being transplanted. There's a strange irony worth pausing on here. While Hanford and White Bluffs disappeared entirely, the government-built town of Richland flourished practically overnight in their place. New schools, paved streets, a hospital, rows of prefabricated houses assigned letter designations instead of architectural names. Residents still call them the alphabet houses today. Richland got a name, a future, and eventually its own proud identity as the Atomic City, home to a high school whose sports teams are still called the Bombers. To this day, Richland High School's official logo depicts a mushroom cloud, a symbol the community has defended for generations as a point of local pride, even as outside visitors regularly find it startling the first time they see it on a gymnasium wall. Hanford and White Bluffs got a 30-day notice and a hole in the map. Both towns exist because of the same project. Only one was allowed to survive it. Before we go further, if you had 30 days to walk away from everything you'd spent your whole life building, no explanation given, would you have gone quietly, or would you have wanted to know exactly what it was for? Tell us in the comments, and let us know where in the city you're watching this from tonight. We read every one of them. The reactors ran around the clock, converting uranium fuel into plutonium through a process most Americans, including many of the workers who built the reactors with their own hands, would not fully understand until after the war had already ended. Once extracted, the plutonium was packed, shipped under armed escort, and sent west, eventually reaching the desert testing grounds of New Mexico, where it became the core of the world's first detonated nuclear device during the Trinity test in July of 1945. Weeks later, plutonium produced on the very land where White Bluffs orchards had once stood became the explosive heart of the bomb code named Fat Man, dropped over Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. Within days, Japan surrendered. A quiet fruit-growing valley, home to a few thousand farmers who never learned why their letters had come, had, without their consent, and largely without their knowledge, become directly responsible for the weapon that ended the deadliest conflict humanity had ever fought. For the displaced families, the news in August of 1945 landed with a strange double weight. Like the rest of the country, many felt genuine relief that the war was over. Sons and husbands coming home instead of shipping out for what many feared would be a brutal invasion of Japan. But that same headline also answered, at last, the question that had haunted them since March of 1943. The letter had never been a mistake. It had been this all along, and no one had been willing or able to simply say so. Farmers of Hanford and White Bluffs were not the only people this project displaced. And they were not even the ones who received the least in return for what was taken. For thousands of years before either town existed, the land along this stretch of the Columbia had belonged to native nations, including the Wanapum, along with neighboring Yakima, Nez Perce, and Umatilla people, who fished, camped, and gathered along the river's banks and its once legendary salmon runs. When the federal government sealed off the region in 1943, those traditional grounds were closed as well. Unlike the farming families down the road, tribal communities received no buyout, no formal compensation, and in most cases, no acknowledgement in the official record that anything had been taken from them at all. It's a detail almost entirely absent from the wartime paperwork, and one researchers working through the site's fuller history have only recently begun documenting with the depth it deserves. Wanapum families had fished this stretch of the Columbia using traditional methods passed down across countless generations, following salmon runs that structured their entire seasonal calendar, timing planting, harvest, and travel around the fish rather than the other way around. When the exclusion zone closed around Hanford in 1943, that access simply ended. No hearing, no settlement, no formal record acknowledging what had been lost. The government's paperwork treated the region as though it had been essentially unoccupied before 1907, erasing thousands of years of continuous presence in a handful of bureaucratic sentences. The project did not slow down once the war ended. If anything, it accelerated. As the Cold War intensified through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, Hanford transformed from a wartime emergency measure into a permanent, expanding pillar of the American nuclear arsenal. By 1955, the site operated 8, and eventually 9, separate production reactors, manufacturing plutonium for a stockpile aimed squarely at the Soviet Union. Over roughly 4 decades, Hanford produced the majority of the plutonium in the entire American nuclear weapons stockpile, tens of thousands of kilograms, feeding an arsenal that, at its Cold War peak, numbered in the tens of thousands of warheads. Salmon runs that had sustained native communities for millennia declined sharply over the same decades, tied to dam construction, industrial discharge, and the ongoing contamination flowing out of the Hanford Reservation itself. And with that expansion came a second harm. The surrounding region would not learn about for nearly 40 years. On the night of December 2, 1949, technicians at Hanford deliberately released a massive plume of radioactive iodine-131 into the open air, a classified experiment that later became known as the Green Run, designed to test whether American surveillance equipment could detect the radioactive signature of a foreign plutonium program, following the Soviet Union's first successful atomic bomb test that same year. Independent estimates place the amount of radioactive iodine released somewhere between 7,000 and 12,000 curies, several hundred times larger than the total release during the 1979 Three Mile Island accident. An event that triggered a full evacuation of nearby residents almost immediately. Nobody downwind of Hanford in 1949 was evacuated. Nobody was warned. Most residents of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho would not learn the Green Run had even happened until internal documents were finally declassified in 1986. It wasn't isolated either. Records eventually confirmed hundreds of thousands of curies of radioactive iodine were released from Hanford's stacks between the mid-1940s and the early 1970s, treated at the time as a routine cost of ongoing plutonium production. The people living across the surrounding communities, many of them the same families who had watched Hanford and White Bluffs disappear a few years earlier, became known as the Downwinders. Their accounts describe a recurring pattern of thyroid disease, unexplained cancers, and reproductive complications many believe traces directly back to decades of exposure they never consented to and were never told about. For families living downwind, the impact rarely arrived as a single dramatic event. A mother's unexplained thyroid surgery in her 40s, a neighbor's childhood leukemia, a run of miscarriages across 2 generations in a single extended family, each treated as isolated bad luck because no one outside a classified government office had the information needed to connect the dots. A large-scale investigation, the Hanford Thyroid Disease Study, eventually examined whether childhood exposure to iodine-131 had measurably increased thyroid disease in the surrounding population. When its results were published, they reported no statistically clear link, a conclusion that satisfied almost no one directly affected by it. Downwinder families argued the study relied on incomplete exposure estimates and arrived years too late. The scientists behind it maintained they had followed the evidence as rigorously as the available data allowed. Neither side ever fully convinced the other. Some families eventually took their case to federal court, in litigation that stretched on for more than 2 decades. The results were mixed, and for many plaintiffs, unsatisfying. Reconstructing an individual's radiation exposure from events 40 or 50 years earlier, using incomplete monitoring data the government itself controlled, proved to be an extraordinarily difficult evidentiary problem, one that outlasted many of the original plaintiffs before it was ever fully settled. A secret wartime land seizure had become by the 1950s something far larger, a permanent federal presence that quietly reshaped an entire region's health, geography, and relationship with its own government, mostly outside the public's knowledge or consent. By the late 1980s, the Cold War that had justified Hanford's existence for 4 decades was finally winding down, and so was the secrecy that had protected it. The last of Hanford's production reactors shut down in 1987. The facility was formally decommissioned in 1989. What remained behind wasn't a town, and it wasn't really a functioning industrial site anymore either. One of the most contaminated pieces of land in the Western Hemisphere. An estimated 56 million gallons of radioactive and chemical waste sitting in aging underground storage tanks, several already leaking slowly toward the water table above the Columbia. The cleanup that followed became and remains the largest and most expensive environmental remediation project in American history. Thousands of workers, tens of billions of dollars. A projected timeline stretching decades into the future. At the center sits a massive vitrification plant designed to convert liquid radioactive waste into a stable glass form that can be stored safely for the long term. Delayed repeatedly by engineering setbacks, full-scale treatment of the most dangerous tank waste did not begin until well into the 21st century, a full lifetime after the last reactor at Hanford stopped producing plutonium. Thousands of people now work at Hanford full-time simply managing the aftermath. More people by some counts than ever lived in Hanford and White Bluffs combined before the evacuation notices went out. And yet, running alongside the slow reckoning with contamination, something else happened that almost no one in 1943 could have predicted. The government began, carefully and selectively, to remember. In 2015, portions of the Hanford site were designated part of the newly created Manhattan Project National Historical Park, alongside sites in Oak Ridge and Los Alamos, a formal act of federal commemoration for the very program that had once required total secrecy simply to function. Visitors today can tour a reconstructed section of the B reactor and hear the story of the scientific race that produced the atomic bomb, told through exhibits and the kind of polished, national park signage that tends to smooth history's rougher edges into something manageable. What the official park tour spends far less time on is the story that came before the reactors were ever built. The 30-day notices. The disinterred cemetery. The burned orchards. The families paid a fraction of what their land was worth, and never once told why they had to leave it. Historians and researchers with the Hanford History Project at Washington State University Tri-Cities have spent years working to change that imbalance, collecting oral histories directly from displaced families and their descendants, including members of the Brueggemann family, along with photographs, land deeds, and copies of the exclusion notices many households quietly kept in kitchen drawers and family Bibles for 70 years. Almost nothing physical remains of either town today. A Department of Energy photo archive, released to the public in 2008, offers some of the only surviving images of Hanford and White Bluffs, exactly as they existed before the letters arrived. Orchard rows heavy with fruit, a general store with its awning out, a ferry landing, a high school football team lined up for a team photo, taken by people who had no idea they were documenting something that would soon be sealed inside a federal reservation. Those photographs had spent more than 60 years catalogued alongside land acquisition paperwork, filed under bureaucratic acquisition numbers, instead of the names of the people or places pictured. When they finally surfaced publicly, many descendants were seeing clear images of their own family homes and streets for the very first time. Descendants who have joined organized tours into the restricted portions of the site described finding faint foundation outlines still visible in the sagebrush. the grid pattern of former streets still traceable from the air decades after the last building came down. The old White Bluffs bank, built from poured concrete rather than wood, is one of the very few original structures still standing. A solitary, hollowed-out landmark inside a nuclear reservation, surrounded by land that used to be somebody's orchard. Access to most of the original town sites remains tightly restricted even now, more than 80 years later, folded into an active federal cleanup zone not open to casual visitors. For families who spent decades not even knowing whether the old home sites were physically still there, walking that ground again, briefly, under supervision on land their own relatives once owned outright, has been described as something closer to visiting a grave than visiting a hometown. Historians remain genuinely divided on how to weigh what happened here, and the divide is worth sitting with rather than resolving too quickly. Some frame the evacuation as a painful but necessary wartime sacrifice. One difficult piece of a national effort that helped end a war that had already killed tens of millions of people worldwide. Others point to the below-market compensation, the complete absence of tribal consultation, the segregated housing built for the very workforce that replaced the farmers, and the decades of undisclosed radioactive exposure that followed, and argue that sacrifice is the wrong word entirely for something that was never actually agreed to by the people who paid for it. Both readings can be true at the same time. That tension is exactly why this story has never fully settled into one comfortable version, no matter how many decades pass. Not every detail here has a settled answer, and it's worth being honest about why the record still runs thin. Exactly how many households ultimately felt fairly compensated versus how many considered their payments a form of legalized theft isn't something any single document resolves. The full human toll of Hanford's radioactive releases on native communities specifically, as opposed to the broader regional downwinder population, also remains far less studied than it should be. Where the evidence runs out, this account says so rather than filling the space with certainty the record doesn't actually support. It's worth asking, too, why this chapter of the Manhattan Project remains so much less known than its counterparts. Los Alamos has its own museum circuit, its own popular mythology built around Robert Oppenheimer. Oak Ridge markets itself openly as the birthplace of American uranium enrichment, with public tours and a well-funded visitor center. Hanford, by comparison, spent most of the 20th century known mainly to specialists, environmental regulators, and the families who once lived there. Part of that is geography. Tucked away far from the interstate tourist routes that pass through New Mexico and Tennessee. But part of it is simply that a farming town erased for a weapons program doesn't fit as neatly into a triumphant wartime narrative as a laboratory full of Nobel laureates does. Sometimes erasure isn't fences and demolition crews. Sometimes it's just which story gets told in the brochure and which one gets left in a family's kitchen drawer. 2 towns, roughly 2,000 people. One of the most consequential pieces of farmland in the history of modern warfare, erased from American maps in the space of a single spring, and largely erased from American memory for the 4 decades that followed. One last irony worth sitting with. The word Hanford never disappeared at all. It's one of the more recognizable place names in American nuclear history, attached to reactors, waste tanks, cleanup budgets, and congressional hearings for 80 years running. The name survived. It simply stopped referring to the town. Somewhere along the way, the federal government kept the label and hollowed out everything it used to mean. The ferry crossing, the football team, the orchard rows, the family that farmed them. The reason was never actually complicated, and it was never really a mystery in the conspiracy theory sense of the word. Hanford and White Bluffs disappeared because the United States government decided, in the opening months of 1943, that ending the war required a weapon so powerful and so dependent on secrecy that entire communities could be legally, quietly written out of existence to build it. And the same instinct for secrecy that justified taking their homes also justified saying almost nothing about what had been done to them. For decades afterward, a German immigrant orchard family who kept their eviction notice folded in a drawer for 70 years because someone, someday, might finally want to know it happened. A cemetery of 177 people moved 30 miles because the dead were in the way of a reactor. A native nation whose relationship with this river stretched back millennia, all but missing from the official wartime paperwork. A radioactive cloud released deliberately over sleeping towns in 1949, kept secret from the very people who breathed it in for the next 37 years. The plutonium made on this land helped end the Second World War. That much has never really been in dispute, but the land itself, and the people paid to disappear from it, carry a second story that ran quietly underneath the official one for most of a century. A story about how quickly a democracy can decide that some sacrifices don't require anyone's actual permission, as long as no one finds out until it's already over. It is a pattern worth remembering precisely because it is not unique to 1943. The same basic shape, a national urgency and vote, a community's consent quietly bypassed, a full accounting delayed for decades under the umbrella of secrecy, has recurred in smaller and larger forms at other sites across the country whenever speed and confidentiality mattered more to the people in charge than the people standing in the way. Hanford is simply one of the clearest, best documented examples, because enough paperwork survived, and enough descendants eventually spoke for the full shape of it to finally come into focus. Hanford and White Bluffs are technically still there, the coordinates never moved, but the towns themselves now exist, mostly in family photo albums, in a handful of federal archive boxes, and in the memories of descendants who are, for the first time in generations, finally being asked to say out loud what they know. There is no monument in either town's original footprint. No plaque marks the spot where the White Bluffs ferry once crossed the river, or where the Hanford High School football team ran drills on a Friday afternoon in the fall of 1942, a few short months before their families would be told to leave for good. The only markers left standing are the ones the land itself still carries, a concrete bank building with no roof, a scatter of foundation lines beneath the sagebrush, and a river that still runs orange in places where the old mine and reactor discharges reached it decades ago. What survives instead is testimony, a folded notice in a family Bible, a photograph of a ferry landing nobody could name until a researcher matched it against an old plat map, an oral history recording made 70 years after the fact of a woman describing exactly what it felt like to watch her father load a truck with everything the family could carry in 30 days and nothing else. That's the real ending of this story. Not a mushroom cloud rising over a foreign city, though that's the ending most documentaries settle for. The real ending is a folded piece of paper kept quietly in a drawer for 70 years that has only just now started being read out loud. If this is the kind of American history you came here for, the kind buried under paperwork instead of dirt, there's another Black Oak investigation waiting for you right now. About a town with its own 30-day notice, its own forgotten names, and its own reasons the government would rather you didn't go looking. Go find it. This story's just getting started.